The audio engineer who was kind of pushing for Sony to make this new console played up the drama a lot, and that the Sony executives actually didn't care that much about Nintendo. He showed up and he was just like, they're disrespecting us. This is so bad. We need to make our own consoles. And they didn't buy it at first, and they didn't actually care that much that Nintendo had maybe dropped them in favor of something else for the CDI. Sony did not think that it was that big of a deal, and they weren't that upset at Nintendo for what had happened. They were just like, business is business. And this guy was like, no, we can't let him get away with it. And he basically was using it to elevate himself in the company when he became the head of the console division at Sony. And it was kind of just in internal politics basically the whole time. And hey, I'm glad he did it, actually, because the Sony PlayStation is a great console.
Yeah.
But the way that he kind of tricked his own company into funding the PlayStation is a pretty funny story, actually. Maybe I'll include part of it.
Welcome back to the State of the Arc podcast. My name is Mike.
My name is Kason.
We have a very fun but certain to be controversial episode for you today.
No, we wouldn't do that.
We're just starting. We're starting the fight.
Lighting the fuse. Yeah.
We're igniting the flame war. You guys are going to carry it out in our stead while we sit back and smile at the comments. Today we're discussing the legacies of Sony, the Sony PlayStation, and Nintendo. Which of these two gaming juggernauts? And we're talking specifically about like consoles, home consoles.
Less about
like games and characters, though that will play a part in it, but more about the gaming console generations, which has had the more impressive legacy up to this point. I want you to know that the approach to this is not based on opinion.
Right.
We will offer our opinions throughout. And that will be obvious in the cases that we do. But I actually created a criteria for rating these consoles, which has basically taken my bias out of it.
Yeah.
For example, and I guess semi-spoiler for the N64. I love that console.
Yeah.
I actually did a video towards the beginning of the year where I sat down and just played through all my N64 games over a weekend. Not like beat them, but just would sit down, play for a while, remember, have nostalgia, then move to the next one kind of thing. I do that from time to time with old game consoles. So if you've seen that video, or if you haven't, go watch it. But if you've seen that video, you know how much I love that console, right? As I talked about in last week's episode, where I talked about how Zelda was the game that sort of like convinced me how great gaming as a medium for storytelling could be.
Yeah.
That console has I have a real high regard for that console for many reasons, such as that. But it does not match up. And I think this is obvious, foregone conclusion to the PlayStation in terms of its cultural impact, in terms of its library, in terms of so many different things. So the system I've created is weighted in such a way to where it's clear the PlayStation in that era was the better console of the two.
Right.
So even though I have personally all this love for the N64, that does not impact the way that these are rated. So here are the criteria that I set up. So there's five criteria. And if a console passes that criteria, it gets a check mark. That's 1 point. Right. And you sort of tally them up. And if you get to 5 out of 5, this is an all-time great console.
Okay.
4 out of 5, this is a great console. 3 out of 5, good.
Yeah.
And it moves on from there. So that's sort of the rating system. How many points of check marks through this criteria can you get? So number 1, what gaming innovation did this console introduce? If any, that has had long-term staying power.
Right.
Meaning it really did innovate. It really did revolutionize. It changed the way we play games.
Yeah.
So that's criteria number 1. Criteria number 2, does it have at least 5 all-time great titles? games that are considered you could easily find on a list of 100 greatest games of all time? Does it have at least 5 of them on the console? Does it have at least 10 great exclusives? Now, I should also mention there are ways to determine this too. I think an all-time great game needs to be somewhere in the 95 to 100 critic rating level.
Right.
There are some exceptions to this, and it's mostly with modern games because there's way more reviewers now, and you can get one guy who hates it and gives it like a 5 out of 10 and brings that aggregate down from the 95 or above it may deserve into the 93 range. Hades is a good example of this. Bloodborne is a good example of this. So we've accounted for that. For like more modern stuff, we know if a game's an all-time great and it's just below that 95, we're going to give it to it, right? So Hades would be included as an example. But does the console have 5 all-time great games? Does it have 10 great exclusive titles that are only on that console and that are in that like 9 and above range? So it doesn't have to be up to 95 all-time great status, but really, really great 9 or above. Are there at least 10 of those that are exclusives to that console? That's criteria number 3. Or wait, was that 4? No. Criteria number 4
is 25.
Does it have 25 great games total? So not exclusives, but that's sort of like 8.5, let's say 8.5 to 9.5 range. This is a great game, 8.5 to 9.5 aggregate score range. Are there 25 of those on the console? And they don't have to be exclusives in that case. And then the final 5th criteria, are there at least 50 good titles? I'm like classifying good 75? As about a 75 and above.
Okay.
So 7.5, 75 and above. If it has 50 of those, it classifies as a good game. Okay. And does the console have at least 50 50 titles of that level? Those are the 5 criteria. I hope that makes sense because I'm not explaining it again. That is how we are judging these.
Yeah.
And we are going to move through each console in each of these companies' long history, determine whether it is, what level of console it is based on those criteria, and how does it contribute to or hurt the legacy of that company over time.
All right.
Makes sense? Any questions from anybody? From
makes
you?
Perfect sense.
Everything good? Let's start with the NES.
The NES.
This is Nintendo Entertainment System.
Yep.
What do we got on that one?
So the NES, first off, does it have 50 good games? The answer is debatable.
Yes, it is debatable, unfortunately. So this was way at the dawn of like home console gaming.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously
like 1985.
There were consoles before the NES, the Atari, and other things. But this is where, like, to a large extent, the industry was just sort of beginning. So the idea of like review scores in magazines and things like this
scores, that
was not really a thing at the time.
No.
So there's a whole lot of games where you can't find them on aggregate sites like Metacritic or OpenCritic.
Or you can't find very many of them.
Yeah. And so this is debatable, but I'm not giving it the check because of that. It's just a little bit obscure.
Okay.
So, because there was a lot of garbage titles on the NES, I'm going to be honest. I mean, I think the console had like well over 1,000 games on it, and most of them were pretty bad. So were 50 of them, at a level that you could call like that. That's actually really solid. That's a game I'd go back and play today. Yeah. That's a good game. I don't know the answer to that. I can't.
Right. This method fails us, but I can give you my answer, which is yes. I had so many games and I had a blast playing them. Most of them I have not played since I was like 8, but I think I have 50 good games.
Yeah. Same applies for the 25 great games. Like again, it's just because we don't have the aggregates, but we know at least it had 10 great exclusives. That's obvious. And it definitely had at least 5 all-time greats. Some of them I listed.
Clearly.
Super Mario Brothers 3, which was my favorite NES game. Punch-Out, Contra, Tetris, Castlevania, many Castlevania games. Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, Ninja Gaiden, The Legend of Zelda. List goes on. I think all of these would classify. And then as an innovation, it was the first home console to have a D-pad.
A D-pad. See, that's fascinating. That's pretty cool.
D-pads have been on controllers ever since. So I kind of stuck around.
So for these debatable ones, did you say no to both? Or did you say 50-50 on either? We don't know, so give it 1 out of 2?
Maybe we should give it 1 out of 2 just for that reason. Yeah, let's do that. So that would bump it up to, I think, great. To great status.
That makes
4 out of the 5 criteria, it hits.
So the NES being a great console, I think is wonderful. If you're going to measure impact, which is where we get into the subjective kind of realm here, the NES.
That's true.
The NES just changed the entire industry, right?
Yeah.
It revolutionized gaming, and it put a console into people's homes the way that other systems had done before it, but not to this scale.
That's a good point. Even if you're a person out there who thinks there probably wasn't 25 great titles, we can at least give it an extra check, I think, simply for being the one that essentially set the foundations for home console gaming that as we know it today.
Yeah.
Like
because the industry
it saved
was not,
the industry. Yeah. It came in at a point where the gaming industry had just been through a terrible crash and was in a really bad state, and there was almost no QA control. And Nintendo is what built a brand of trust to where if it had that Nintendo seal of approval on the box,
that was a big deal.
I know I'm not buying ET level game here. Yeah. Like, this isn't total trash. This will at least work if I put it into my machine.
Right.
So they set a precedent with this console that essentially rescued this industry and set it on the course that we know it as today. Yeah. I can give it a check mark for that alone and bump it up to a great status, and I think that that's totally valid.
Yeah, it's kind of like in baseball where you say who's the greatest baseball player of all time, and you have to say Babe Ruth. You just have to. Like, I know there's probably a ton of half of the MLB is probably better than him at this point, right? If you're just going to be objective about it.
Sure.
But come on, man, he was the first. He was early on. Yeah. He was the first great ball player. You know, you got to give him some credit for that.
You have to. Yeah. So I think that's fair. I think calling it a great console is fair. So it gets 4 out of the 5.
Very nice. Very nice.
The Super Nintendo, the SNES, according to these criteria, gets all 5.
All 5.
Time great.
It's sweet. It's swept. It's a total sweep.
Absolutely.
Great.
So, again,
Good
at
news.
this point, we have more of a sort of a supporting structure around, like, as far as like games, news, and media.
Right.
Reviews are starting to become a more regular thing. Gaming magazines like Nintendo Power and many others.
Famitsu.
Where they're doing these sort of like professional reviews.
Right.
And that people are using as ways to gauge whether or not. So we have more of that now in the aggregates as far as like archived. And so I was able to confirm all of these things. It has at least 50 good games, at least 25 great games, at least 10 great exclusives.
At least 5
all-time greats. Some of those that I listed: Super Metroid, Super Mario World, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy 3 or 6, of course, Donkey Kong Country, Mario RPG, Terranigma, which a lot of people don't know about, but it did come out in English, just not in America and Canada, but in Europe it did.
Yeah.
And what innovation did it bring? Well, it gets a check for bringing shoulder buttons and kind of the 4, like the diamond-shaped buttons over here. So shoulder buttons. Every console ever since then has had those things on the controller.
That's basically the standard, because I know when the NES came out, and then the Sega Genesis or one of the early Sega systems came out and had 3 buttons. And it was like, oh, this is crazy. And then the SNES had 4 buttons. And it was like they were one-upping each other. You would just imagine. Then the N64 had like 6 buttons. But that has kind of since been pared back a little. It's like, we went a little too far there. 4 is the standard now.
Yes.
That's what everyone uses. PlayStation, Xbox.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
The Sega Genesis had the 6.
And I know with the N64, you can argue there was quite a few superfluous elements to that controller. The third handle, not least among them. But those were meant to be like camera controls. Like, I know.
Wait a minute.
The N64 was an early version of what became 2 sticks, right? The dual stick.
Yes.
But it wasn't used that way. It was mostly just 6 buttons.
Sorry, I got caught up a little bit here.
Yeah.
The Sega Genesis controller, did it originally have 3? It was A, B, and C?
Yeah, A, B, C, I think.
It was just the 3 buttons. I'm thinking of the Turbo Sega Genesis controller.
6?
that had, I think, 6 on it. Here's the original Genesis controller.
Yes, I
A, B, and
recognize
C.
that.
The next one, that's the one I'm thinking of because I have that one.
I do remember seeing
it has
that.
the A, B, and C, and then it has 3 sort of like gray buttons above it.
What's the point of that?
I don't know.
Like, would some games be like, if you don't have the right controller, you can't play it?
Not sure. Here's another version of it. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So it's not
Okay,
like
so
the default Sega Genesis controller, which you had the 3. Anyway, we should talk about Sega while we're at this.
We should, because they're a better competitor for the NES and SNES era.
Yeah, this isn't.
No.
They're not being factored necessarily in this larger sort of like discussion we're having about Sony and Nintendo. We're focusing on that. But the Sega Genesis did have some great all-time greats: Sonic the Hedgehog, Phantasy Star 4,
that's right,
Shining Force 2. Golden Axe, Shinobi 3, Beyond Oasis.
Shinobi's super fun.
So, like, you know, I want to throw some love out there to the Sega consoles. Here's what the unfortunate thing is for the Saturn and the Dreamcast.
Yeah.
They just unfortunately didn't have the volume to carry them. So while the criteria I've set up would set, let's say, the Sega Dreamcast out as a below average console, so like a 1 out of 5 or a bad in that case. Listen, it had 41 good titles out of 50.
This is like pretty close.
Had 16 great titles out of 25.
Okay.
It had 0 great exclusives. I don't think it had any exclusives to that console that would classify as great.
The Dreamcast?
Yeah, because the games weren't exclusive.
Yeah.
But it did have 5 all-time greats on it, like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, and Soul Calibur, and Skies of Arcadia, and Quake 3, Arena, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and Grandia 2. These were all just also available on other consoles. So it just didn't have the volume and support, but I would still look at the innovation, which is like the screen on the controller.
Yeah, a little screen
that
there.
made its way back much later into things like the Switch or Wii U. But I love that console. I thought it was really, really cool.
Yeah,
I didn't have one, but I thought they were cool.
Controller was a little too big. But.
So it's unfortunate. I think Sega just was not like their consoles kind of released at the wrong time. It was almost this in-between kind of place where it's like the Dreamcast comes out and it's the most powerful kind of console for a minute, but then like it's followed up really quickly by like the PS2.
And the PS2 way outpowered it. Unfortunately.
So,
and it could play movies, so that was the cool.
Just came to the market at the wrong time.
It was really strange, though, that Sega kind of called it quits in the console world around the time, you know, it wasn't that much later, basically just in that same generation. Xbox is like, oh, there's room for another competitor. Let's do it. And they're still making consoles today. So it's almost like Sega just miscalculated. There was a few things that just didn't work for them, but it's not that that they were forced out, you know, through, I don't know. It's not that there wasn't room for another console because Xbox showed that there was. It's just that you're right. I think it's a timing thing. They were just a little bit behind everybody.
I'm going to get controversial for 1 second again with a great one is saying, oh, Shenmue, dude, like OMG, like what are you talking about? That's an all-time great exclusive for the Dreamcast. I don't think it is. I think Shenmue kind of sucks. But by the criteria through which we are viewing this, it didn't score high enough to be included in that category. So that's not me just saying that. I am saying that, but that's not just me saying that. That's the aggregate speaking as well. I had a friend who was a huge Dreamcast guy.
Yeah.
And he was just telling me so much about how great Shenmue was and how I needed to play this. I was over at his house, my buddy who lives in Colorado Springs. I sat down with the Sega Dreamcast and I started playing Shenmue. And he went out to do something else, and he came back all excited. Isn't this game great? I was like, bro, this game freaking sucks. I hate this game so much, dude. I can't play this another second. Fetch this game. So I am not a Shenmue fan at all.
It looks like it got an 88 out of 100 on
80 out of 100
is pretty good. It's not like horrible.
Now I'm trying to think, because I think I had set great to be 90 or above. But it does have a 9.0 as a user score. So it is a beloved game. And you know what? I will concede this.
Nice.
I will concede this. Based on my buddy who loved it, based on how a lot of other people feel about it, based on that 9.0 aggregate user score for Shenmue, and the near 90 that it got, I am willing to give the Dreamcast one great exclusive. Does that make you feel better?
Very nice.
Does that make you Dreamcast fans feel better now?
They did it.
You had
they did
one
it.
great exclusive.
It only
game.
takes one good game to justify a whole console.
All right. Anyway, this is not about that, but I wanted to at least throw some love out to Sega consoles. I thought they were great. I loved them.
Yeah.
I'd never had them, and so they were kind of cool to go to like buddy's house.
I remember the commercials. That was clearly the demographic they were going for. It was like, oh, Sega's the cool console with cool stuff.
Yeah.
Sega!
All right. So now it's time to get into PS1 and N64.
All right. This is where the real war
So let's
happens.
do the easy one. PS1 is an all-time great console.
PS1
it's
wins.
not a debate.
It won.
It is. It's just so easy. It might be the all-time great console.
It's up there, man. It's up there.
So yeah, 50 good games, check. 25 great games, check. 10 great exclusives, check. 5 of its all-time greats. I have more than 5 here. Final Fantasy 7 and 9. Some of you 8 fans might get mad at me, but I'm not including that. Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, Vagrant Story, Gran Turismo 2, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Tekken 3, Soul Reaver, Crash 3.
Dang.
The CD-ROM is what I'm including as its and memory cards as its innovation to the industry that has carried on ever since. So check marks, easy, all 5. Now, what surprised me a lot because of my love for the N64 was that it only comes out as an average console. It only gets 3 out of 5.
Dang it.
So let's see. Actually, no, we bumped it up to good.
It says good. 3 out of 5 is good, though. 3 out of 5 is considered good.
3 out of 5 is considered good. Okay, you only get 3 out of 5.
It should be average, but, it's like middle.
So, again, volume was its problem, kind of like the Dreamcast.
Yeah.
So, does it have 50 good games? I only found 37. Does it have 25 great games? Nope, I only found 14. 10 great exclusives, there it does check because it's Nintendo.
Because it's Nintendo.
They just released their own first-party stuff. Usually those are pretty great, or at least reviewed that highly. 5 of its all-time greats, so it gets a check mark here. Ocarina of Time, GoldenEye, Majora's Mask, Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Star Fox 64, and its innovation, the Rumble Pack and the analog stick.
Yeah, the analog stick was a big deal. I remember you can get PS1s with an analog stick, but I believe that controller was released later.
Yeah, so the original PlayStation controller just had a D-pad.
And it wasn't even really a D-pad. It was 4 buttons. They weren't all connected together like the typical Nintendo D-pad, which is only important because of the analog I think was it the GameCube that was able to kind of use a little bit more of the analog technology, and it wasn't just like an on-off on-off-button kind of thing.
Right.
But yeah, it's technically sort of not a D-pad, but whatever.
Yeah. The
Close enough.
PlayStation released a second controller after the N64 came out that had 2 sticks on it,
and it had 2 sticks. Yeah. Which was, that 2 sticks was very interesting because the N64 only had 1. But why not the innovation of 3 handles? Wasn't that a great innovation?
Yeah.
I was so confused when it came out. Like,
this one,
what?
This one hurt me a little bit because again, this is just all personal opinion. For what the N64 does have, I think it's freaking unbelievable. To me, it's an all-time great.
Yeah.
But I don't think based on this criteria, you can give it that.
Nope.
But there's another criteria we could possibly add to
Let's
this.
make up one so that it can get it.
Which is sales. I think that is relevant.
Okay.
So Nintendo had a really great start. The NES, Super NES, and we can include the Game Boy into that as well. I didn't put handheld consoles on here, but like that's another element of Nintendo's legacy that is like super huge. It has dominated the handheld market and has had some what I would consider probably easily all-time great consoles, handheld consoles, and certainly has Sony beat there. So it got off to a great start, but then as soon as Sony entered the market, it beat out Nintendo pretty much right away.
Yeah,
like as soon as and you did a whole video.
I did, yeah.
That was based on how Sony and Nintendo were working together on a console that would feature CD-ROM.
I made a video too there's an update to that video. I think that's like our most viewed video on the channel. and I made an update to it because some new info surfaced about 6 years ago, and I never uploaded the update to the YouTube channel. It's actually sitting on my desktop right now. Maybe I'll just put it up just for fun. It's an old video. I made it a while ago, but there was some news that broke about, in particular, and I can't remember the names anymore. This has been a while since I made that video, but the audio engineer guy who was kind of pushing for Sony to make this new console, that he kind of played up the drama a lot, and that the Sony executives actually didn't care that much about Nintendo. He showed up and he was just like, they're disrespecting us. This is so bad. We need to make our own consoles. And they didn't buy it at first, and they didn't actually care that much that Nintendo had maybe dropped them in favor of something else for the CDI or whatever that kind of fake in-between console that never ended up really, well, I guess the CDI came out, but it didn't really go anywhere. It didn't do much. And he basically kind of tricked his own bosses into funding the PlayStation because he, I need to just upload that video because I got the info right there and I can't quite remember it now. But other than to say that Sony did not think that it was that big of a deal, and they weren't that upset at Nintendo for what had happened. They were just like, business is business. And this guy was like, no, we can't let him get away with it. And he basically was using it to elevate himself in the company when he became the head of the console division at Sony. And it was kind of just in internal politics basically the whole time. And hey, I'm glad he did it actually, because the Sony PlayStation is a great console.
Yeah.
But the way that he kind of tricked his own company into funding the PlayStation is a pretty funny story, actually.
So yeah, Sony comes in with just a freaking sledgehammer and just like absolutely dominates that particular console era.
Yeah, they did.
The Saturn, which came a little after this, didn't do so hot. The Nintendo 64 was carried entirely by its first-party exclusives and Rareware.
Yeah, Rare, who Microsoft ended up purchasing.
Yeah.
That was, I thought that was crazy. I felt like Nintendo never should have let Rare
That
go.
was a disastrous decision.
Yeah.
Terrible decision to not keep them as a kind of a, it's not first party, but it kind of
like
is
second
first party,
sort of.
second party, studio. Kind of the way Monolith Soft is now.
Yeah. Or, what's the one that made that fun Mario Strikers? What was that company called? Mario Strikers, remember that?
Oh yeah.
What are they called again? Anyways, there's several kind of second party Nintendo developers.
Oh sure, yeah.
They're not part of Nintendo.
Howl or something like that.
No, that's Kirby and whatnot, right?
Yeah, but that's another example.
What's funny is that it's not just bad for Nintendo that Rare got bought by Microsoft. It's bad for Rare.
Bad for Rare. Really bad for Rare.
It just didn't work out for them or It was bad for everybody. It was bad for Microsoft and Rare and Nintendo.
Got David here saying, did you know that Nintendo dropped the Sony deal because they, or rather Hiroshi Yamaguchi, the president of Nintendo at the time, realized Sony intended to trap Nintendo to buy them out down the line?
Oh, hey.
What's the story of that? That's a part of the story that was not told in your video.
I'm not aware of this. I'm not aware of this.
Well, maybe that's the story Nintendo tells. Who knows?
Maybe that's why the Sony executives weren't that upset when Nintendo backed out, because they were like, yeah, well, whatever. They caught on to our scheme, our evil scheme.
Well, if you got a source for that, David, hit me up because I'd love to read about that.
Next Level Games, that's the one that
Next Level.
They were kind of a second party Nintendo. I think they still are, actually.
Anyway, so Sony came in with a sledgehammer. Like I said, they won this round. They sold over 100 million freaking PlayStations, I think. Or was that PlayStation 2?
PS2 sold like 150. PS1
was really high, though. It was probably up in the 80s or pretty close to 100 million consoles sold.
Yeah.
And I think that the Nintendo 64 was somewhere in the 30
over 100 million, 102.
102. So it broke 100 million.
Yeah.
Nintendo sold like 32, 33 million, something like that. It just paled in comparison.
Yeah.
They had a new real competitor who was like new kid on the block. Right. And dominated even into the next generation. We head into the PlayStation 2.
That was crazy that they did it like right off the bat.
Let's hit up PlayStation 2. PlayStation 2 is easily an all-time great console.
Yeah.
50 good games, check. 25 great games, check. 10 great exclusives, easy. 5 of its all-time greats. Resident Evil 4, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Metal Gear Solid 3, Okami, Final Fantasy X, Shadow of the Colossus, and Klonoa 2, just to name a few.
Yeah.
Innovation. A check DVD drive, so you could actually watch movies.
You could watch movies on
your console.
A lot of my friends said that was the selling point for the PS2, basically.
It really was for a lot of families, I feel like.
Yeah.
They could watch their DVDs on it and have a gaming console.
Yeah.
Brilliant idea.
Yep.
The analog triggers, so the triggers could be pulled in an analog fashion rather than an on and off fashion. Nintendo still refuses to put analog triggers on their freaking controllers. Drives me crazy. Should always have an analog trigger. And then backwards compatibility. You could play your PlayStation 1 games on your PlayStation 2. So these were all innovations that have very much become selling points or features that are expected for consoles up to this day, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right? Can I watch my Blu-ray movies on it? This is becoming a little less relevant now with streaming.
But
streaming
people still stream
is available
on
the console.
Yeah,
so it's kind of the evolution of that.
I know in the early days when Netflix started doing streaming, they, invested in an app for the Nintendo Wii, and that they said that actually the highest percentage of consumers that watched Netflix online at the time, back in like 2009 or something, was people watching it from the Wii.
Yes.
And that's fascinating, right? So it did kind of turn into that. But shoot, I had another thing. Oh, I almost wonder too if their backwards compatibility thing was just a deep flex for something that Nintendo, it's almost like Nintendo couldn't do that. Nintendo had to go DVD. They couldn't just make new consoles.
The discs, they have those little tiny.
Yes.
With the GameCube.
They're DVDs, but yeah, they're like little funny.
I don't know what the
DVDs.
Technical term for that is.
They hold less data anyways. Nintendo had to do it their own way.
They had to do a really freaking small CD.
Ooh, we're different. We're unique. We still limit data for game companies, and people didn't like that much. But it's almost like Sony was like daring Nintendo, like, our stuff's backwards compatible, which means you have two choices. You can do another console with cartridges so that it can play the N64 also. Or you can ditch that and go DVDs, but people will never be able to play the old games on it. Right. And it's just like Sony, they win both ways.
They freaking had a stranglehold on the industry at this point.
They
walked in and just grabbed Nintendo by the throat and was like, "Bet you guys."
They were so smart. They outmaneuvered Nintendo. They really did.
Yeah.
And Nintendo was like, well, we're going to do these little things that, anyways, the Wii was backwards compatible, but the GameCube just didn't have that option.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it.
The GameCube surprised me.
Yeah.
According to the criteria, it is actually an all-time great console. This surprised me a lot.
GameCube.
Because
very good.
All of my friends who had PS2s, all they did was talk crap about the GameCube.
And
GameCube's a kiddie console, looks so stupid, a purple color.
It's got a handle on it. I don't know why it has a handle.
I literally don't know why it has a handle. But listen, it had 50 good games. It had 25 great games. It had 10 great exclusives. Here are 5 of its all-time greats. Metroid Prime, phenomenal game. Resident Evil 4, phenomenal game. Wind Waker, phenomenal. Smash Brothers Melee, freaking phenomenal. Pikmin 2, among others. And its innovation was the wireless controller.
Yeah.
It had I think they're called the Wavebirds.
Yeah, I had one, man.
Those are freaking sweet.
Yeah.
Now, if we are to, here's how we can, it's not a debate, but easily separate the PS2. You just include that 6th criteria of sales. I think the GameCube sold like 15 million or something embarrassing like that.
It didn't even beat the N64.
And the PS2, if I'm not mistaken, is the highest selling home console of all time.
150.
Maybe 150. The DS slightly edged it.
It's possible.
But I'm pretty sure it's number 1 or number 2 highest home console sales of all time. So clearly it beats it by probably more than 100 million units sold.
It beat it many times over. Yeah, that's wild. People vote with their wallets, so the people said, the people spoke.
If we're keeping track of the legacy at this point, Nintendo has this great start and sort of sets the industry on its path. And then Sony just walked in and just stepped all over its face. Yeah. And while the Nintendo consoles were still very, very good and had a lot of good titles,
good quality,
they were really struggling.
Yeah.
Really freaking struggling to compete.
And the DS is what basically carried Nintendo.
The
Game Boy Advance.
The handheld lines.
And the DS, those sold extremely well.
It's what kept them in the game.
Yes.
Was that they were the only ones really in the handheld market at the time.
And around this time also, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi was like, I can't run this company, apparently. His mafia-like ways were not quite as coercive as they used to be, and he wasn't able to just own and dominate the industry the way he could before. And this is when they took a chance for the first time in over 100 years. Nintendo decided to allow someone outside of the Yamauchi family to become the CEO and to run the company, and that was Satoru Iwata.
Satoru Iwata,
that
beast.
guy. And then
Such a beast.
Once he took over, man, Nintendo really got back on their feet.
Oh yeah. So when we move up here to the Wii, again, there's a little bit of room here for, if we add the sales, like we said, that's 6 criteria. The Wii won that console generation
100 million.
by a lot.
Maybe not 100 million, but by quite a bit.
I think that it started out that way.
Yeah.
Like the Wii's sales were really front loaded with Wii Sports.
The PS3 was expensive when it first came out.
And it did not start off strong, but it ended strong. So I think the PlayStation 3 ended up in the 70 plus million.
70?
Yeah. 70 plus
Whoa.
million sales total.
Hey, Sony did
So
great.
it had a good tail, but it really struggled at the start because of how freaking expensive
You're
it
right.
was.
87
It got up to 80
million.
Yeah. And
Wow.
but the Wii was in that like 130 million range
Yeah.
or something like that. But that was all front loaded. So what's really interesting about the sales is that the Wii had this huge spike at the beginning and had a terrible tail, and the PlayStation 3 had a terrible start but a really strong tail.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
While the total numbers favor Nintendo here,
Yeah.
I don't know necessarily that you can say that.
That's a good point, because the Wii was
Yeah.
also a cheaper console. So if you're
Yes.
going to look at maybe something like margins or like just the power that you got for the bang for the buck,
Yeah.
I would wonder with those numbers. I would wonder if the Wii actually made as much money as the PS3.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
So even though they sold more units, it was a weaker console that was, cheaper.
Yeah, exactly.
So
So,
that's interesting.
all of that is worth considering. I'm not necessarily going to give them the tie. I'd give the edge to Nintendo here.
I would too. Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's
I think
not
it clearly
it's
won.
not nearly as much of a gap as maybe some people think.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah.
It also had tons of volume. Kind of like the NES, where it's just had like
Tons of
so
games.
many fetching games,
Yeah.
and most of them are really bad.
Most of them were bad because it was the gimmick. It was, hey, there's a
Yeah.
new thing, and every company was kind of like, well, let's create a little division of our company to like see what cool, new, unique thing we can do with the Wii. And every gaming company basically did that, and all those games, ended up on the Wii. And a lot of them weren't that good. This is
Yeah.
kind of like NES level, but that rejuvenates the industry. You can talk about the NES and say it really. Like every movie company was like, let's have a game on our movie, and it was like those were the worst games. It didn't matter. Like people didn't care that much. With the Wii, you had something similar. Like let's make a motion control gimmicky something or other. But it ultimately, I think, is good for the industry at least. Like it weeds out all of the bad people, but it breathed life into, hey, there's new stuff we can do here. And while most of the new stuff wasn't good, like as is common, like that's like a rule, some of it really was quite good. And every gaming console modern nowadays has motion controls in their controllers.
Yeah.
So
So that's the innovation, obviously, is
Yeah,
motion
motion
controls. But
controls.
there's a caveat to this. There's an asterisk on this. People did not, in the long term, accept its main feature of motion controls, which is the swinging,
the one hand,
the control around
maybe the
for
pointing.
a sword and like aiming this way.
Yeah.
However,
Yeah.
I'm still giving it the check because some form of motion controls pretty much still
gyroscope,
exists.
yeah.
And I love gyro aiming.
Yeah,
I
me
love
too.
it a lot. I like it way more than using a stick.
Yeah.
And that has sort of stuck around in each controller for these two companies in their consoles afterwards has had at least some element of that, some aspect of motion controls. So I'm going to give it to it, but with an asterisk on it, because it was not the way they intended for it
Right.
to revolutionize the industry.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it seemed promising, and then people started realize they hated it, and people did not want to play games that way. However, if we talk about the Switch and the fact that
It
the two,
technically
that's one
has
way I
that.
really like to play it is a controller in either hand. It's
Yeah.
really comfortable. I wish the controllers themselves were more rounded so that they
like
fit
on the bottom.
into
And the reason they don't do it is
your
because
palm a little better.
Sometimes you hold it sideways. Yeah.
So I understand why, but
Yeah.
but
That would
is
be
how
nice.
I would play games if they were a little more ergonomic in the hand.
Yeah.
Having them separated from each other, I can sit in any friggin' position I
Yeah.
want. and not have to hold it, all out in front of you.
And they're
all
not
the time.
connected by a cord like the Wii was.
So I'm giving it to it, but with an asterisk is my point.
Very nice, very nice.
So it gets that point for innovation, and it gets a point for 50 good games, and I guess we could give it a point for sales.
Sure.
But it's actually kind of sad, considering its enormous library, that there were 12 great games on this console.
Ouch.
Only 12.
Ouch.
Holy crap.
My gosh.
There's got to be well more than 1,000, probably 2,000 games on the Wii.
Like
maybe
worldwide?
even more than that.
There's
and
tons.
only 12 of them
Yeah.
were an 8.5 or above, or I'm trying to remember if it was 8.5 or 9. Anyway,
that's pretty bad.
They're not great. Most of these games are not that good. And it only had 7 great exclusives, which is a real hit for Nintendo because they are carried by their exclusives.
That's right.
They don't even have 5 all-time greats of their own IPs. A lot of that is like it missed a... well, actually, that's not true. They did have one Metroid Prime game on that. I think Metroid Prime 3 was a Wii game,
yeah,
right?
I remember
because
that,
Prime 1 and 2 were on the GameCube. But Prime 3 was not. And I don't believe Prime gets up to that 95 range to classify it as
well, even Twilight
scored
Princess
a little lower than that. Twilight Princess, I think Twilight Princess was exactly 95, but that was a GameCube game.
Yeah. It's hard to know.
And so I didn't include it there for that reason.
Fair enough.
Even though I played the Wii version of that, but it did have Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, which are 2 of the best games ever made.
Yeah.
And then Xenoblade Chronicles ended up being one of its all-time great games. So,
and that's it. 3.
That's it.
It had 3.
And a large part of the reason why it didn't have more is because it just wasn't a platform which could get
like ports, like easy ports
of great all-time games onto it.
It was a little too weak, and it had too unique of a controller.
It set itself back a little bit in that aspect. It missed out on a ton of titles that maybe it could have otherwise had. So it only rose up to the good status. So
dang.
The PS3, on the other hand, is great. Now, what's so weird about it is that I think the PS3 is looked back on as like one of the worst PlayStation consoles. It's not considered to be as great.
Well, between 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, I mean, the 3 does feel to me like
probably the lull in its legacy.
It's the lull. If Sony had a lull, it sounds like Sony never has a lull.
It had the numbers in terms of good and great games.
Yeah.
It did not have 10 all-time great, it did not have 10 great exclusives.
Huh.
I think I put 7 or 8, and there must have been one that was a debatable one in there. But it did have 5 all-time greats. So The Last of Us, Red Dead Redemption, Uncharted 2, BioShock, Demon's Souls, and Dark Souls. And its innovation was the Blu-ray drive and the 6-axis controller. So those are 2 things that stuck around for years after that. And I liked the PS3 a lot as a console, but its mistake was in like it was a difficult console to develop for.
Oh, really?
Something about the way that its sort of internal hardware was designed made it difficult to port like an Xbox game over to it really easily. So you'd get a lot of games that when they did try to do it, they were by far the worst version. Skyrim's a great example of this. Skyrim was horrible on the PS5.
Which is funny because the PS3 was technically more powerful than the Xbox 360.
Yes. But only if you started your development specifically for that console.
Interesting.
So yeah, it after this, Sony, I think the reason that I can't remember the reason now that I think about it. This might be rumor that I'm remembering. It was like a piracy issue or something like that they were trying to curb. But like in the long term or in the long haul, they actually ended up hurting their relationships with developers more. And so like it just ended up being a struggle to get. So like the worst version of a multi-plat title from that era was always like the PS5 version or PS3 version.
version.
The Xbox 360 version.
I remember that.
Was always the better one.
If you were playing like even like FIFA or Madden or sports games and stuff, it was like Xbox 360 was way better to play it on than the PlayStation.
This is where Xbox peaked. Speaking of other
360
developers, this was the Xbox 360.
Well, they got in first.
Yeah.
I remember in 2005, they eked it in right in December of 05, and they were able to be the first to market in that new generation. And Nintendo, I think, was actually ended up being the last.
I believe that the Wii launched before the PS5.
Oh, did it launch
3.
before?
I keep saying 5. PS3.
Okay.
But they were around the same time.
Around the same, just the next year in November or something.
2006.
Yeah.
Right as I left to Las Vegas. I think it was that like winter, that holiday season was when those two consoles came out.
That's right,
Yeah. Well, I guess both of those are kind of a bit of a lull in certain ways for both.
Yeah.
As terms of like the legacies of these companies over time. Like this particular generation was a little bit like, tried something really different or whatever, at least in Nintendo's case, and didn't really work out the way that they had hoped. But there was some good stuff.
They still
there.
sold and
they
still made a lot of money.
Made a lot of money, and it set them up for success.
Yeah.
But the next one, let's do the Wii U first because this console sucked.
Oh, no.
I actually really didn't like the Wii U. It was the first Nintendo console I remember thinking like this. I think this is a bad console. I don't play this much. Like there's not a lot on this. It's kind of a weird gimmick. And they took that gimmick and made it into an idea that works with the Switch.
Yes.
But for what it was, I was like, this is kind of a stupid idea. Like they tried to sell it based on the fact that like, oh, you can keep playing while someone else watches TV in the same room.
Yeah, little did they know that people don't watch TV anymore. People watch YouTube.
Yeah, like, I don't know. It's like, I would rather take the thing somewhere. I'm not going to sit in the same room and watch TV that someone else wants to watch while... Like, I would just rather take the thing, which is what the Switch is. I can take it with me. It's actually fully mobile.
So the idea with the Wii U was that it's a home console that can also be on the go. But with the Switch it's a mobile console that can also be played at home, right?
So it's like you could maybe take it into one room away before you'd start having connectivity issues.
It had like a 20-foot kind of radius or 30-foot.
It just wasn't, in practice, it just wasn't really that interesting of a feature.
Yeah.
And then it also lagged again in terms of power, so it didn't get a lot of the ports from the other leading consoles.
And the Wii U, that was just the first player controller. Second player, it's like, well, pair up a Wii controller, I guess, right? And so to play the Wii U, you would have to use like a Wii controller, and then only one person got to have that controller, right? It just felt weird. There was an incongruousness. There was asymmetry among the players if you're playing like a first-person shooter or something.
Yeah.
And they tried to take advantage of it. Like, no, look, we can have different types of games. Like, was it that fun Ghost game? It's like a Luigi's Mansion something or other, but you got the one person who's got the Wii U and he can go hide or he can go somewhere and then all the ghosts have to go find him or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was. But it was fun, but it's the kind of game that gets old really quick and you can't play that often, and you can't play unless there's exactly 4 people wanting to play it.
So if we run through the criteria on the Wii U, it didn't have 50 good games.
No.
I counted 43.
Okay.
It had 6 great titles.
Jeez, man.
6, not even close to 25.
This was such a rough time for Nintendo.
It was bad.
Goodness.
It only had 5 great exclusives, not even close to 10. It had 0 all-time great games.
And that is wild. Now, how do we count Breath of the Wild here?
I'm giving that to the Switch.
Okay.
Because it launched with the Switch.
Yes, it did.
I guess technically
Twilight Princess also did that.
Bring
it up.
But Twilight Princess had been announced for the springtime of 2006 on the GameCube. They delayed it on purpose to be a launch title for the Wii. But I was pissed because I would have been able to play it had it actually launched when the game was done on the GameCube.
Huh.
And then I didn't get to play it because then I had to go serve my mission in Las Vegas. Story for another time, and also I've told on another podcast.
Yeah.
And then I didn't get to play the game when it actually came out. And I was so stoked for that game. So they like purposefully held that back. That was a GameCube game. Now, I believe that Breath of the Wild...
I think all of that still applies for Breath of the Wild.
I don't know, though. I don't know if Breath of the Wild was ready to launch
It got delayed.
the Switch.
I don't know that either. I think there might be a question mark there. But it did get delayed.
Should we do a Dreamcast concession here? The Switch with the Wii U gets 1
gets
all-time great.
Half.
console or
No.
exclusive or
I
whatever?
agree that basically everyone played Breath of the Wild on the Switch. I
Yes.
went to one person's house in my life where they had it on the Wii U, and I was like, what?
What the heck, dude?
What are you thinking? But I knew tons of people who played Twilight Princess on the GameCube, so
Yes.
there's something there.
So the innovation I put here, I almost want to take it away. I want to give the Wii U 0 points because it's off-screen play, which I guess you could say technically carried over into what we have everyone trying to do now that the Switch got popular. I mean, even Sony has a little device that I don't think sold very well. It's a little screen that you can plug controllers into, and it's kind of like the Wii U though.
Steam has something like this though. The deck, Steam Deck,
the Steam Deck,
yeah.
And so but that's that's the Switch's.
You're right. That's less
innovation,
Wii U.
not the Wii U's. That's why I want to take it away.
Interesting. Well.
So
Goodness.
I would say the Wii
So,
U got
hold on.
literally 0 out of the 5 criteria.
So we went from should we give the Wii U a pity point like the Dreamcast to we're going to take away that which it has.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
I would have no problem doing that.
I think
the Wii
that's
U was an
probably
abysmal
fine.
freaking console.
Man, that's so
abysmal.
So unfortunate.
Abysmal.
I love
it. Even its exclusive Mario title was not like it's Super Mario 3D. No, 3D World was the handheld.
There was a 3D World
3DS
for the Wii
one.
U as well, though.
But it's
I
the one
think
with
the
the cat.
games
The one with the cat power
went together. Yeah, the cat.
Even that game, I would say, is probably my least favorite Mario home console game.
Which is possible, but it was still a really good game.
It's still really good.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's a bad game
Yeah.
at all. It's fun and it's pretty good. But I cannot, in good conscience, call that like an all-time great video game. It's like the least memorable of all Mario games ever.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree.
Some people might argue instead that the new Super Mario Brothers games
like the 2D new
are
ones.
that kind of like, are
Those
that
are
kind
fun,
of like,
though.
I like them better
Yeah.
than this, but even they, got derivative and they released a whole bunch of them and they were kind of all the same.
Yeah.
And they're not super memorable to me.
Okay.
So like this period of like home console Mario was just like really not that great in comparison to its legacy, I felt like.
Now, I know what you're all thinking. Wasn't Splatoon an all-time great game?
That's
And
what
the
Kason was
answer,
thinking.
the answer is yes, it is. And Mike's list is wrong. But objectively speaking, I looked it up on Metacritic and it was like an 86 or 88. It was not. It did not get reviewed. I thought for sure that this was a big deal. I remember when Nintendo first announced Splatoon, and that's all. The whole E3. That's all anyone was talking about. Was like, but show me more Splatoon. That game looked crazy.
Yeah, people really liked it.
Yeah, it was a fantastic, very fun game. But yeah, the reviews in the end were not enough to get it
Bump it
over.
into that
to bump
status.
it. So that was when I think back to the Wii U, I think
Splatoon.
back to playing Splatoon and how much fun that was. And I don't even remember any other game that I played for the Wii U.
Yep. Again,
That was it. That was the one.
Again, Nintendo was carried during this period by its handheld.
Yes,
The 3DS and the
that
DS,
sold quite well.
which
yeah.
both were phenomenally successful.
And like Ocarina of Time 3D.
So
and-
we get this kind of pivot of the legacy, right? Nintendo started off, if you go back to its roots and back to the beginning, if you're living in the past, the Nintendo home consoles were the greatest.
Yeah.
They peaked with the Super Nintendo.
80s
And
and early
then,
90s.
then Sony stepped in and basically took over.
Yeah.
And every console generation from there on up to where we're at,
Yeah.
I would say
Sony has-
dominated the home console market and Nintendo really struggled. Though they had some flash successes like the
with
Wii.
the Wii.
But where it
Yeah.
continued to cement itself and where it beat Sony was in its handheld
Yeah.
devices.
Which is what Nintendo ended up doing was to merge the handheld and console division. And
Together.
this has always made me question. So the Switch has been a huge success, right? Big hit, sold tons of units. But did it sell more units than the Wii and DS combined? You know what I mean?
Oh.
Like, well, if you're going to combine them and say, we're not making a handheld console anymore, this is our handheld console, then you actually have to delete those sales. And now Nintendo,
Where is
the same,
the Switch at?
Oh,
Where is it?
It's over 100 million.
It's well over that, but has it
I believe
eclipsed the PS2 yet?
I believe it has. Yes, I believe
it might
has.
it might be the highest selling home console of all time.
What the heck? Switch sales, and it took me to the shop page. Please don't.
No, they're just trying to get you to buy stuff.
What? Versus other
The
consoles?
PSP was a good console, or handheld console. That was Sony's strongest handheld, and it was really good, and I liked it. But sales-wise and numbers-wise, I don't think it comes even close to the DS. I liked both of those consoles quite a lot, though. I never had a Vita.
146 as of September of 2024. Nintendo has sold 146 million. It is almost
the highest.
It is about
selling.
probably this Christmas. It is going to overtake the PS2 finally.
Yes. So here's what's interesting.
It only took 2 billion more people on the
Wii U sits
earth.
in this really weird space where it is kind of the competitor to the PS4 era.
Yes.
But it died so fast that
Yeah.
Nintendo had to launch another console within the same generation.
Basically, yeah.
And so I still kind of consider it a competitor of the PS4 more so than the PS5, even though it's kind of in that in-between state.
Sure, the Switch.
And
Makes
the
sense.
Nintendo Switch is easily an all-time great console at this point.
Yes.
It also had kind of a slow start, in my opinion. I think it sold well, so I'm not saying that, but it didn't have a great volume of amazing titles. It
The
took
Switch?
time.
Yeah, it took a while.
And because of the volume of sales, because of the novelty of the idea, the innovation,
Yeah.
which has definitely taken hold, and like this is probably one of the greatest innovations Nintendo has had in its home console market.
Yep.
It
But
now
it-
has
yeah.
volume to absolutely cement it as an all-time great console. It
Yeah.
might be my favorite video game console.
I think
of
so.
all
This
time.
is like the ultimate console, right?
Yeah.
It's including handhelds and everything. It's like the perfect mixture of everything that was good about every single console ever. Except it uses cartridges, which
Except it
is
uses cartridges.
hilarious. I think that is hilarious.
It
That
is. It has a kind of funny.
So just full
funny
circle.
coincidence. But so yeah, we take a step back. Well, let's look at the PS4.
Well,
real
flash
quick.
memory was the big innovation that allowed
Yes.
cartridges to become a thing again.
Let's look at the PS4 real quick. So the PS4 I've got as good. It's got the 50. It does not have the 25 great. It does have the 10 great exclusives. It does have 1, 2, 3, 4.
No.
No, it only has 4 all-time
Well,
greats.
it probably
God of War.
It may have more
Well,
since
I think
this
God of
came
War
out.
2 is technically on the PS4. It's got a PS4 and PS5 version.
Okay.
Maybe I'm wrong about that, but okay. So God of War, The Witcher 3, Bloodborne, Nier Automata. So that's 4 that I counted up at the time I made this. There may be one that was a multi-console PS5 and PS4 type of thing that might be able to slide in there. Innovation,
For the PS5?
PS4.
It's for the PS4, it's a PS3 plus 6 years.
I didn't have one.
It is not.
That's where it was
they,
missing.
They didn't do anything different. And some people might critique your list or your criteria. You critique the criteria. How about that? For including that at all. Does every console have to innovate? And
If it's going to be considered an all-time great
I think
console,
it has
it's
to.
got to change the industry.
Otherwise,
it's got to
it's
change
just
the way you play.
It's just the same thing again.
Yes.
Yeah. If your only thing is PS5 is better than PS4 because graphical, like the RAM, it has more RAM and it has a better video card. Like that's cool. That's fine. But the idea when you're thinking of a great console, the idea of what makes a console great is that it's different in a meaningful way from
moving
everything
the industry
else.
forward.
Yeah.
in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I don't think the PS4 had that.
it did not.
Personally.
It did not.
And so, yeah, now you've had 2 Sony consoles in a row,
Well, the
PS4
Pro,
and PS3, that it kind of lulled. So again,
Okay.
you had Sony, if we're living in the past, it came in really strong, like Nintendo came in really strong.
Yeah.
But then not like struggled. Struggle's not the right word.
Not the right
It had
word.
good sales. It's
It's
made money.
plateaued,
It
might be
has
the better
good
word.
Plateauing.
It's
maybe
kind of just
is the right
plateaued.
thing. And
Whereas-
that's kind of how I
yeah.
feel about PS5, although we're not including that yet because its run is not over. We can't judge it yet.
Yeah, it would
But
fail.
it's really struggling. I don't know
Yeah.
what is exclusive to the PS5 currently that would be considered a great game. Maybe no, because those come to PC now. Because we got the whole PC market that is really
has really
changing things
disrupted
at this
things.
point.
Yeah.
It's totally disrupted it.
Yeah.
And so the PS5 to me, I have like 3 games on it. and one of them is freaking Demon Souls.
Oh, that old game. They
so
remade it.
I
Right?
had like Final Fantasy 16, which is also now available on PC.
Yeah.
And I had
16,
God
I
of
have that
War, the second God of War of these new God of War titles that came with the console. It was like installed on it. And I bought this game called Kenna that I thought looked really cool. That's it. I literally have had no reason to buy anything else on the PS5.
The market's changing, and I wonder how Sony. This is so funny because it would have been easy 10 or 15 years ago to be like, Nintendo's the one that's not going to make it. Sony is clearly well positioned.
Yes.
And all of a sudden it's like, look, man, Nintendo with its IP and with its like extreme focus on innovation is probably going to be fine.
Yes.
Microsoft is like, come on, I know Xbox.
They're on death's door.
I know Xbox is, but Microsoft is the company.
Oh,
like,
Microsoft, no.
They're going to be fine.
Yeah.
The Steam PC market is a Microsoft market, right?
Yeah.
Like the company, if we're just going to talk about the company, is going to be fine. Sony is the one that's like kind of in a more difficult position, I think. You know what? Because I guess Sony makes like headphones and all this other stuff too. So maybe I shouldn't include Microsoft's other businesses. If we're just going to say that, that's fine. But Nintendo seems like they are probably going to navigate the next decade pretty well. Sony and Xbox are maybe going to have a difficult time.
Great One is correcting me, and I'm glad you did this.
Ooh.
There have been new PS4 like really great games that have come out since I made this list.
Like Ghost of Tsushima?
For transparency purposes.
Well, we assumed
we kind of did this video already once before. We're double dipping on this idea.
been a while.
We kind of changed it a bit.
Yeah.
I did all of this research in like 2019 for the most part. I did update the Switch, but at the time, this was the case for PS4. So he's correcting me on Death Stranding, Red Dead Redemption 2, Ghosts of Tsushima. There have been some other pretty great.
Yeah.
I haven't looked into those scores. I don't know if they qualify as all-time greats. I think a lot of people would argue like a game like Ghosts of Tsushima shouldn't be considered an all-time great. I love that game.
Yeah.
I want to cover it on the podcast.
Oh, we should. I do too.
Love Ghosts of Tsushima.
Play it in Akira Kurosawa mode.
Death Stranding is definitely, most definitely more controversial in terms of considering an all-time great. It's really out there and really weird, and a lot of people don't like that. I liked it. I thought it was pretty great. I'd love to cover that on the podcast.
Yeah,
too.
I'd love to also.
And then Red Dead Redemption 2, I think you can definitely consider an all-time great.
Yeah.
So thank you for correcting me on that.
Great. PS4 is great. We'll just make that call.
We can bump that up to great. I think it qualifies. But there is definitely, I still hold to, a sense of like plateauing.
And that they don't know where to go from
PlayStation consoles are going. And that's definitely true for the 5.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens, but like people have not responded well to its mid-console cycle update with the PS4, PS5 Pro. Also Horizon Zero Dawn, that was another one that was really great on PS4.
Yeah.
So there's some titles there that I had not played at the time I made this list, and I forgot to update that console, even though I did update the Switch for this.
Switch.
But the Switch, I think, definitely wins out in terms of impact, sales, numbers of great titles, great exclusives, all of this. So we're at this weird place where if we're tracking the legacies, Nintendo started out great, got smashed in the home console market for a decade, maybe decade plus, and its handheld market was carrying it.
Yep.
Then it decided to merge its handheld and console market, had a absolutely ridiculous, amazing success, probably my favorite video game console of all time.
Yeah,
so now it's all of a sudden become king again for one generation. How is Sony going to respond to that?
That is the question.
Forward.
Because basically the PS2 to the PS5, I could even say the PS1 to the PS5, it's the same console again, just more powerful.
Yeah.
They really, like, there may have been innovations here and there, right? Like, as we've pointed out, but it's the same thing. They're not changing much. They're just like same controller, same, we're just making the games run in higher computing power, basically, every iteration. And at some point, and this is what I think Satoru Iwata and I think Reggie Fils-Aimé brought this up at some point too, like, a contest of pure power with diminishing marginal returns is a losing game.
Yeah.
And just like diminishing marginal returns gets you that plateau on the asymptote, that's where I think Sony is. So at some point it's like, look, man, there is a difference between PS4 and PS5. Like there is. It's just not that pronounced. It's not that big of a difference.
Yeah.
And I would be quite disappointed if the Switch 2, whatever it's going to be called, it should be announced sometime soon, probably after the holidays. I would be disappointed if it was just a more powerful Switch.
Oh man, I hope it's not.
I hope it's not
but
too.
I think they're probably going to do that.
I think so too. I'm worried that's what they're going to do.
That's what they're going to do.
It's the easy, cheap, don't worry about R&D, like just give the people the same thing except a little better. And I think that's probably what it's going to be. But at the same time, I don't want them to change too much from what the Switch is, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do want a general Switchy type thing, but I want a different type of experience that is better. Unless we're just going to say,
how are we pushing it forward?
You can't be better than the Switch, which I don't know. The Switch is great, best console ever. I don't think it's the best that's possible, which means there will still be changes, right? There should still be changes. I'm worried that they're going to do that. But if they do that, then Nintendo might fall into the same trap that Sony, in my opinion, has kind of put themselves in as well.
Yeah.
If Nintendo wants to be king, they're going to do it through innovation, not through competing with PCs. Like, come on.
Right.
Come on.
That's not just not
That's
gonna happen.
a losing
That's
battle.
not going to happen.
Yeah.
To respond to Great One about another thing, this was a weird thing to try to account for. And that's FromSoft games.
Yeah.
So FromSoft has had a lot of games. Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, Demon Souls, Sekiro, Bloodborne,
Bloodborne.
Now Elden Ring, right?
That's right, yeah.
Elden Ring, I think, based on its, almost unbelievable success.
Yes.
I think it sold over 30 million
Holy
copies.
cow, man. That is wild. That is wild.
I know. Especially for the type of game it is and how hard it is.
Yeah. Jeez,
it
man.
had unbelievable success. I think that's undeniably an all-time great.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder based on the criteria I had created. I bumped Bloodborne up because some gamers just haven't gotten good yet. So their complaints and
fault.
reviews brought those review scores down a little bit to under the bar for what I had set for all-time great. And I think all of the Dark Souls games suffered from this, right? Where certain people just don't get it or it doesn't click with them or whatever. I would consider them all to be of that caliber, specifically Dark Souls 1, which is one of my favorite games ever.
Yeah.
But I didn't know whether to put them on the list because I would be breaking my own rules of my criteria.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. They should all be up in that upper echelon, right? But I just didn't know what to do with those. So those were a little bit of outliers. I gave it to Bloodborne because that's an exclusive to the PlayStation 4. The other ones are not exclusive titles, so I felt a little bit less pressure to sort of make them bump them into the categories that I wanted them to be in.
That's hilarious.
But anyway, that's kind of where we're at. So
Yeah.
It's interesting
look forward to the future.
track. You see both of them take their hits, get their wins. I don't know whose legacy is greater. I think they're on pretty equal standing at this point.
I think so too. I look back at Nintendo and Sony, and this is partly why we aren't so big in the console wars anymore.
No.
Because after 30 years or however long we've been playing games for, it's like, look, man, they've each had their wins. They've each had their losses. They've each been at the top. They've each, struggled at different points and in different ways. And we can look back. I have nostalgic memories of both the PS1 and the N64. I have nostalgic memories of both the PS2 and the GameCube. I have nostalgic memories of the PS3 and the Wii. So it's like I can it's all there for me now. Whereas when I was a kid, it was only Nintendo. That's all I had. My memories of Sega
we were Nintendo warriors.
Yeah, totally.
Because that's what we had at home.
But the more I play other consoles, the more I'm like, I can see it now, and I appreciate what they've all been able to accomplish. Sony and Nintendo have both done amazing things, and I love that they're in a field, in a market that allows competition of this nature to where they can make each other better, right? To where Sony can show up and be like, look, Nintendo, you've been like dropping the ball on this disc gaming thing. Like, we're going to do it and you're going to get hurt, but you're eventually going to get wise. And the whole industry is going to be elevated now.
You need
and that type of competition, which Hiroshi Yamauchi was a master at shutting out competition. Sony was maybe just a little too hard for him to shut out in terms of like pure competition. But, you know, that he got a little above his pay grade on that one. But for all the other game manufacturers, he was like, no, we're the game in town and you guys are going to do what we do. But when you stifle competition like that, that's when innovation stops happening and the industry stops getting better as a whole. And once you have decent competitors that make people mad because, mine's better, no, mine's better, it may feel passionate at the time, but the truth is you're both right and the competition's good and healthy because it forced the industry to get to this point now where the Switch, Nintendo would never have made the Switch with Yamauchi and the N64. If the N64 outsold the PS1, like we never would have gotten the Switch.
We would be in a really
kidding
different industry today.
Totally different industry. But because of the competition, because of the nature of this, because of people, you know, saying, no, mine's better for this reason, no, mine's better for this reason. And, you know, eventually at some point, the whole industry kind of says they had a point and our investors want money, so let's do this. And eventually, because we've ragged on investors quite a bit in the past, this is one area where the competition and the people kind of seeking profits actually can help the industry as a whole. Because it's like, look, man, if we're going to be successful, we've got to do what they're doing, even though we hate them, right? We hate them. You Nintendo fanboys hated the Sony people, and you Sony people hated the Nintendo people. But at some point, there needs to be somebody who's above it all with the decision saying, yeah, but they have a point. We're going to do what they're doing now. And often it's money that pushes that. But anyways, the competition is good for the industry. That's what I'm saying.
So 2 things I want to say. First of all, I was cured of my console warrior disease when I finally became old enough to have a job and buy my own console.
You know,
and I had a GameCube at home.
Ooh, once again, money.
But I went out and bought a PlayStation 2. And I played Shadow of the Colossus, and I realized this is one of the greatest games of all time. Holy fetch, this is good. And then
you were hurting yourself.
I started like playing all these great PlayStation 2 games. I was like, holy crap. What was I doing to myself?
Yes, that was totally you.
I'm just holding myself back from having all this great stuff.
You built a little prison around yourself.
I'm an idiot. I'm a freaking moron for all this time. Like, why am I like carrying pitchforks for a $1 billion company that doesn't care about me at all instead of just playing what's available to me? And that's actually right around the time when like I started. I mean, I had always been into Final Fantasy and had played those at friends' houses, but I hadn't played Final Fantasy 12 at that point. And so, you know, I started getting more into the history of, you know, all the great titles I missed on the PlayStation 1, which was just immense.
Tons.
Right? And that's kind of, you know, I started doing like YouTube and things like that after that, and I started playing games from like that ran the gamut, I guess. And realized, holy crap, there's way too much stuff I missed out on by not having a PlayStation growing up, and I got a lot to catch up on now. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Console wars are dumb. The only people who benefit are like billion-dollar companies and like super rich investors and CEOs. They're the only ones who benefit from you going out and evangelizing and fighting for them. You do not benefit from missing out on the stuff that you're missing out on that other competitor out there. So
true.
There's that. Next, we are at a point right now where the industry is kind of in a bubbling point. A bubble seems to be ready to pop on the gaming industry. We had Great One here saying everything feels stagnant now, and Beermo saying everything's feeling homogenized. I think this is very true, which is why I will be so disappointed if the Switch 2 is just the Switch 2.
Yeah, that would mean that the money people are being conservative. And they're like, we don't want to take risks right now.
It's exactly what I expect to happen.
Yeah, me too.
Based on the volatility of the industry right now, based on how much these companies are often slaves to, you know, the sort of investment system, which they're in. What they need is to find some way to innovate the way we play games. That's what the industry needs right now. We have been having this like chase for greater processing and more power to a point where people are starting to become less and less impressed by that chase. The returns are diminishing.
It's true because graphics
before our eyes.
Yeah, totally. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. But also the point to buy a new console, the reason to go from the PS4 to the PS5, in terms of graphics, it's not that noticeable the way that the PS1 to PS2 was, or PS2 to PS3.
Not even close.
You're getting these marginal gains, not only like but in both ways. Like the consoles, you can't get certain games now. That's the biggest thing. You got to keep buying the new console so you can play the newest game. But the consoles aren't that much better. Now you can say, "Oh, what are you talking about? It's double the RAM
this and that,
and it's
you know,
8K."
you got like
no.
You got hard drives now that load things way faster. Your load times are
SSDs
diminished and things like that. I get that.
But the returns are diminishing in this model.
It used to be very much in the industry a selling point for a console to be the most powerful console.
Yeah.
And it's like, the graphics are going to be the best on that.
Yeah.
I think more and more and more today, people care so much less about that.
Well, pretty soon, like my wife and kids are playing Kingdom Hearts 3 streaming. Like it's not even on the Switch. It's just the whole thing's being processed on the cloud. And I know it's not working that well. There's a bunch of critiques saying, this doesn't work well. But that's the future, you guys. You are going to be streaming your games. It doesn't matter how powerful your computer or console is. The processing is going to be done elsewhere. Yeah. And you're just going to get the stream of what you're playing, right? And now when internet gets fast enough and when everything works for that, I don't know, it might take 10 more years.
Yeah.
But that's where things are going. So this whole game of we're just chasing after the pure power is one that is short-sighted.
Yeah. So what I think the industry needs now to avoid decline, stagnation, and all of that is someone needs to come up with a better way to play and interact. We need, whether that's on the software side, just like innovating the game itself, but I think the hardware is also part of that. We got to have some way of playing this thing. I don't know if it's VR. They've been trying to make that work and it hasn't really caught on.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's going to be, but there needs to be a shakeup in the way we play that gives dimension and a new approach and that will spark all kinds of new ideas in developers. Oh, wow. With that, we could do this kind of crazy creative idea. And it needs something like that to happen. But the problem is, there's so much money. It's so big. They are so risk averse that I'm curious to see whether they can convince higher ups and investors to take a chance on something crazy.
Now, here's the funny thing. I think the industry has benefited from Nintendo for a long time because it's like, well, Nintendo takes all the risk to do all the different things, and then Sony and Xbox, and they just kind of take, that worked. Okay, I'll do it on my thing too. Then they don't need to do anything, right? So that's why it's such a big deal if Nintendo stops caring too much to innovate in this next iteration. If Nintendo stops, they're the only ones doing it. And so if Nintendo doesn't do it, that signals exactly what you're talking about, a horrible situation for the entire industry. Because Sony and Xbox have kind of shown that they're not willing to take that risk the way that Nintendo has been. And if Nintendo also decides, we're done taking risks too. You guys have been piggybacking off of us this whole time. And each time we do something that works, you just take it 2 years later and do your own version of it. And then you don't ever have to do it yourself. If Nintendo, as the R&D arm of the video game industry, stops doing it, then kind of you're in a bad spot. Maybe a new company needs to show up from the ground out of nowhere, just like the PS1, and just kind of sweep the deck for a few generations.
And that's becoming harder and harder to do.
It is, yeah.
I'm not. But if
I thought Steam Deck would be bigger than it is.
If the industry is going to thrive, it needs something like that. Something that changes how we play, not tries to just iterate or increase how we're already doing it. Increase power of how we're already doing it. This is the least excited I've ever been. This current console generation, PS5 era. It's like I just literally don't care about almost anything that's coming out current year.
Yeah.
There are some exceptions to that. And I still do play new games from time to time. But I am finding myself doing it way less than ever in my whole life, which is crazy. because it's just the same things, man. It's the same open world game design. It's the same RPG systems. It's the same shooters. It's so homogenized.
Yeah.
It's all the freaking same. It all looks the same. It all plays the same. And there's nothing that actually catches my attention and goes, that's different. That's exciting. I haven't seen that done before. If the gaming industry doesn't get that in the next 10 years, it will not be in a good place, is my prediction.
Yeah, I agree. That's what Beardmo's saying. Buy a mid-tier PC and just play indies. That's true. I agree with that, actually. That's where the action's happening. But that's also part of the reason why the gaming industry...
I feel like there's some homogenization even going on in the indie game.
Oh, yes. Too. I've been noticing that, too.
I mean, because it's kind of like how... when like digital cameras like DSLRs came out, all of a sudden everybody could be a filmmaker.
Yes.
It's like it's the tools are so readily available. Like almost anybody who really wants to can make a game, and so you get a lot of copycats even in that sort of sector, these quote unquote indie space,
the Unity,
and so. It's also struggling, I feel like. Not to say that there aren't some really exciting, cool titles. And there are. And I'm finding them, from time to time and whatnot. But
when pixel art had that big rejuvenation, like with the indie games like Stardew Valley and Undertale and things like Golf Story, which I love.
Golf Story is a fun game. I
love Golf Story.
I like Golf Story.
What a great game.
Golf Story is a great game.
You had just wild people were going ham, but I've been noticing a little bit in the industry for indie games as well that there's a bit of homogenization too, and that's unfortunate because they're the future. They're the ones that are going to carry us into the future. I don't think it's going to be these big corporations. I think it's going to be some smaller guys that show up and really show everybody like, hey,
shake it up, man.
Like Minecraft, man.
Shake
My
it
goodness,
up.
Minecraft was a huge disruptor to the entire industry. Something like that needs to come along.
Yep.
And
something like that needs to come along, not only just in game design, but in hardware, like gaming hardware.
Yeah.
Someone needs to come in and shake that up.
You know what's weird though? Like everyone's got a phone in their pocket. Like you're competing with somebody's phone at this point. And people can, I don't really play games on my phone. A lot of people do, but it's almost like if a company can just take advantage of the fact that everyone has a phone and just sell like a little dinky controller.
I think that ship has sailed at this point too.
It's hard
because they would have done it by now. If
I
they
agree. Nobody can take it because everyone's phones are so different. It's hard to make a software work the same on everyone's phone.
People, for whatever reason, just don't use them the same way.
No, they don't.
They don't think of it that way.
Which is good for the industry, thinking about that.
You have like the Diablo, I guess it's like Blizzard. They announced a Diablo game that was like exclusive to mobile phones, and they got booed right out of the freaking arena or wherever they were, the stage that they were. Then they were like, it's a meme. Don't you guys have phones? Was what they said in response to those boos. And that just intensified the criticism. People do not want the classic sort of like home console gaming experience here.
On the phone.
That I think it's a foregone conclusion at this point.
I think that's accurate. I think that's true as well.
So it's not this device that's going to change it. It's something else.
Okay.
I don't know what it is because it hasn't been invented yet.
Well, if you did, then maybe you'd be, doing something else.
Oh, my God.
Well, this was a blast. Sony and Nintendo, I love them both for different reasons.
I do
and
too.
I'm grateful for both of them. I love both of them. I want to see
their success in the future.
Me too, because they've proven to be good competitors that make each other and everything
I
better.
hope Sony goes like totally in the bonkers direction with whatever their next consoles. Do not even don't call it the PS6.
Don't say PS6.
Don't make the PS6. Don't do that.
Man.
Do something freaking nuts that we've never seen before. Do not make the Switch 2, although I'm convinced that's exactly what's going to happen.
I know, me too. And that'll be a bad sign for the industry.
Don't do that.
What if they call it the stayplation? That'll be good, huh? Mixing things up a little.
Anyways, fellas, hope you enjoyed this. We're going to log off, but we appreciate you, and we'll see you again next time. Peace out.